So next, we're going to change the file permission on authorized keys. SSH will complain over time because it's very particular about the permissions. We're going to change it to 644. Then we're going to disable our root login, and then we're going to restart our SSH daemon. So why do we disable our root login? I will show you. I've gone on about it, but I want to demonstrate this. So we're going to say sudo / cat again / var. We're going to take a look at the auth log. So remember, logs live at /var log. All logs live here. And then we can say auth log. Then you put in your password. So what's going on in the world today? So auth log is going to say, hey, what's going on in our system? And this is not, it's hard to read when it's so zoomed in. But auth log just says, like, hey, who's trying to connect to our system and what's going on? And already this brand new server, barely connected to the internet, doesn't do anything. What do you see in your auth log?
Invalid user. Invalid user. Trying to connect.
Yeah. You see a lot of, you might see random usernames. They're guessing commonly used usernames. See a lot for root, because that's pretty common. Where's a good one here? Invalid user, called user. So the minute you bring a server online into the world, people are going to try to connect into it. Over time, you'll see this grow. You'll see various different types of exploits trying to be applied, common passwords, common usernames, common ports. So I talk a lot about security. I spend a long time on it, probably not enough time, honestly, because this is the reality of the world you're living in. Everybody is trying to get into your system, and if you give them even a little bit, they will take over, and then it's gone. The only way you can solve that is to delete your system entirely, which sometimes, if they get far enough, you can't even do. You lost control of your system. Hence, SSH keys, no passwords. We're going to disable root login just to be sure, because we don't ever need to be logged in as root anymore. I found that .ssh authorized keys was already there. It may be there. It kind of depends on how you set up the system. If you follow the same steps, it's never been there for me. I've always had to create it. But again, there's so many things going on. It's possible you did something a little bit different this time around. Maybe it was a different operating system or a different version or something else.
Still logged in as root, possibly?
Yeah, if you're logged as root, that authorized keys file will probably be there. So you need to switch to the user you actually need. Otherwise, none of this will work. You'll just be logging it. You're just like saying the same information that's already there. Yeah, good call there, Kyle. So the next thing we want to do is we want to change the permissions of the authorized keys files. Otherwise, when we start the SSH daemon, the process that's actually listening for SSH connections, it's probably going to complain. So we're going to use something called chmod. Actually, let me man chmod. Change file mode bits, yes. So remember we said ls-la shows the permissions? So these are the actual permissions for the files. Read, R stands for read, write stands for write, X stands for execute. But there's different levels. There's root, there's anybody, and then there's the user itself. And I forget the actual order, because we'll cover permissions a little bit later down the road. But chmod is just saying we're changing the bits of access to that. So in this case, we're going to say chmod 644, and I don't think we need sudo for this. Yeah, we don't need sudo for this. And we're just going to change the permissions on the SSH file. Actually, I'm going to dive into that just to check out the permissions here. Clear, ls-la. Just want to take a look. All right, so let's chmod 644. And then we're doing the authorized keys. Now let's do ls-la. OK. So we see we changed it's never executable. Authorized keys was never going to be executed. It's not a script. So all we did by changing the permissions, we just flipped a few more bits saying we are the only ones allowed to write to it, our user. Everybody else can read from it. That's totally fine. Any process, any system can read from it, but we're the only ones who are allowed to write to it. And that's what we did with 644. And we'll talk a bit more about permissions. The numbers don't line up the way you think. It's not like a straightforward thing. It's just something we had to do for the SSH daemon. The next thing we want to do is, what did we say? We want to disable the root login. So now we're going to look at our SSH config. So config and files, when we get to Nginx, it's always going to live under the etc/etc. So let's go ahead and check that out. However, we do need to be sudo. Anything in etc is going to need to be sudo because we're messing with things now, getting real serious. So we're going to say sudo vi/etc/ssh, and we want the sshd, so that's the SSH daemon, the process that's running. We want the config file there. Let's dive in. All right, so there's a few parts of this whole process where I say, if you touch things, they can go off the rails very quickly. You can lock yourself out. This is one of these times. Try not to mess with the SSH file, the config file, unless you know what you're doing. There's a reason why we follow these exact steps for creating the user, double checking sudo access, logging out, making sure we can log in as the user before we disable root. Because if you can't log in with your new user and you disable root, what happens?
Lose access to your server.
You lose access to your server and no one can get it back. You have to delete your entire server and start over. So we don't want that. That's why we follow these very, very tight steps just to double check we're in the right place. So if you're not there yet, do not do this step until you have all the previous steps. So let's scroll down to permit root login. And we're just going to edit that file to say no. There's a lot of other fun we can have in here. We can enforce passwords. SSH keys need to have passwords. We can disable them. We can change our port. We can do lots of things. But again, don't mess around in here too much unless you know what you're doing. You can put yourself in a corner very quickly. So we're going to escape. We're going to write quit. But that's not it. Anytime we change a config for a daemon is an Actus process. It's not reading the config file. It only reads it once at runtime, and then it keeps it in memory. So we need to restart the SSH process. So we can say sudo service SSH daemon, SSHD, restart. All right. Hopefully you didn't get kicked out at this point. If you got kicked out, something bad happened, and I don't know. A quick tip, if you're ever like, I'm tired of sudoing everything, I really want to be root. If you say sudo-i, you can jump back to root. So the user is always there. Root is always there. You can't get rid of it, obviously. But we don't operate as root most of the time, or actually any of the time. There are some cases when you want to do this when you're tired of sudoing, but I really don't recommend it. So we'll say exit. We'll jump back out to our original user. And let's just test this out just to be sure that we actually did something. So I'm going to SSH and exit out. I'm going to try to log in as root, and it should deny me if we did things correctly, which is good. So I'm going to SSH back in. So if you did something wrong, you can't log in as root and you can't log in as your user, it's OK. Go back through the slides and the steps and just follow the steps again to recreate the server and bring it back up, and double check every single line you're doing. This, I will say, is the most dangerous part of the course in terms of where things can go pretty wrong for you. But we're pretty careful.